Next, from Springfield, Senate Republican leader Christine Radogno and Republican House leader Tom Cross discussed the legislative agenda before members of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Business. This runs about 25 minutes. The entire 45 minutes is available on our website, illinoischannel.org.
She's along with Senate Republican leader Christine Radogno, who's just running a few minutes late. But we're going to go ahead and get started. Many of you, I think, know who Tom is. He's been a very, very strong Republican leader for the business community in Illinois and a great partner when it comes to trying to stop the mess that's going on at the Capitol. And so I know Tom wanted to talk just a little bit about maybe pensions.
Whenever.
Why don't you go ahead and talk about pensions for a few minutes, and then when Chris gets here, we'll get into some of the other issues.
Kim said she didn't want me to talk about pensions because you heard how long? About an hour's worth of that?
I said their eyes are glazing over.
I would just say this. We're going to talk about business issues in a minute, and they are very important. And whether it's workers' comp, it's tort reform, it's unemployment insurance, it's enterprise zones, all of that's very, very important. But in my opinion, very humble opinion, the issue of the day is pensions. It is consuming us. It has consumed us. I don't know to what degree Bill and Dick Ingram talked about it, but we'll spend $7.5 billion on pensions this year. And the number is going to climb every year to the point where, you know, the crowding out issue is very real. We're going to cut this year out of the budget at least $1 billion, and we may cut more. And that's because, in my opinion, the pressures of the pension. You hear all of these arguments about diminishment and you can't do this, you can't do that. The reality of the day is people are getting a larger benefit than what they're paying for. And it's not a diminishment issue. It is, you have to pay for what you're getting. And when you think about what goes on in this state, you have the capacity to double your pension after 20 years. You're going to retire at age 55 or 60. You're going to get a 3% COLA that compounds. That means you will go from 50 to 100,000 in 20 or 25 years. And when you just do the math of what people put in and what they're going to get out, it doesn't work. It is destroying the state from a financial standpoint. So I'm sure Dick and Bill put that out there, but we have got to address this in a very, very meaningful way, and as painful as it is. And someone talked about gridlock, and you know, everyone asked, when is the right time to do this? There's never going to be a good time to do pension reform. And what's interesting is we heard from the Rhode Island treasurer about a month ago. I was in Chicago, and she said that they did such a good job of explaining the problem in Rhode Island, and especially this crowding out issue, because education was affected and hospitals were affected and human services, local schools, et cetera, that people saw a no vote on the pension reform bill as a liability. Right now, people think if you vote yes, it's a liability in this state, because people still, in my opinion, have not quite gotten the impact of what we need to do. The guy or gal on the street who doesn't follow this stuff, I don't think has any understanding of how bad this is. I think you all probably do, and you should follow it, and you do follow it. But bottom line is, I think most everything, Medicaid is almost equivalent, but everything flows from the pension and Medicaid argument. And if we don't get a handle on both of them in a real significant, meaningful way, this year, we'll either not have a pension system in the next 10 or 15 years, who knows when, I'm not sure the exact date, or we'll quit funding a variety of other things. It's inevitable. One of the two is going to happen. And it's a shame that the unions to this point have not offered any solutions. I've got a bill out there that would, I think, in a pretty dramatic way change it. They refuse to negotiate with us. They refuse to negotiate with the governor's office. So I would keep an eye on it, because, as I said, I think it's the issue of the day. So it's a long explanation.
What do you think? I mean, they heard a lot of statistics today, but I'm wondering, could you just give them a little insight into the process, the what's going on behind the scenes? I mean, you know, when we did workers' compensation reform, we had dual tracks. We were negotiating with the Speaker's office, Senate President, Governor. Just give them a little bit of insight as to what's.
The governor has a pension working group, and the pension working group is made up of legislators in the governor's office, and then they have been meeting on a regular basis with folks like Dick Ingram to lay out the situation that's going on with the TRS and the other 5 systems. And they've met with legislative leaders, and then they've met with the groups like the Civic Committee, and then we're meeting with some of the unions, and to try to start coming out with some kind of guidelines, principles, and even actually maybe the idea of a bill. But it's somewhat hard to negotiate when all the parties don't participate. And then, you know, we've got a bill out there. We've been trying to work with the Speaker on it. And then Cullerton has some of his own ideas that no one's really seen yet, so we're waiting on that. So I think a lot will flow, Kim, after we get some kind of report, who knows what it'll be, from the governor's office in the next, hopefully the next week.
I mean, do you think that, because obviously organized labor is a big constituent of the Democrats, who of course control the House and the Senate and the governor's office, is there any pressure, or do you think the Democrats will say to their constituent, big labor, just sit down and take it? Or will they be given something that will make it a little easier to go down in terms
I'm not so sure they're going to do pension reform. I think that they will, like we often see in this body, nibbling around the edges. And then we'll say, oh, we did pension reform. One of the big things they're talking about is shifting the cost of what we call normal cost to local school districts. And that's about $1.5 billion, a little more than $1 billion that local school districts and ultimately property taxpayers will absorb. And I can assure you that that will be part of the discussion, and they will say, well, that's part of pension reform. That, to me, in my very humble opinion, does nothing to reform the unfunded liability other than say the state screwed up and now we're going to shift it to the locals and local property taxpayers. But I think that's what we have to keep an eye on. I think that will be considered reform. And the unions will like that. To a degree. To a degree, they will like that.
Is there any, because often what they do to the business community on these big issues is they try to split us. They try to say, okay, NFIB chamber, if you don't like the bill, then we'll negotiate with the other business groups. That way we get half the pie. Is there any thought that the unions would split? Or IFT, IEA?
I don't know if the unions will split, but what they'll start doing is picking off school districts. They'll maybe go to the School Board Association or the Principal Association or maybe the IEA and say, you ought to like the idea of a cost shift. You know, you've heard the mayor say of Chicago, well, we ought to do a cost shift because that's the fair thing to do because we pay for our pension in Chicago. Now, they also get a lot more money than the rest of the state with respect to school funding. So I don't think it's, they're going to try, but I think the unions will stay together. So far, they've stayed together.
So if you had to bet pension reform, what, 50-50?
I think that there will be an attempt to do some nibbling around the edges, and I think that'll be the extent of it. I think. I may be wrong.
Well, that sort of just the way you described that process, it's very similar when we went through the workers' compensation reform process last year. And I think for everyone in this room, at least from the NFIB members, and I know the chamber members, workers' compensation is by far one of the top issues in terms of real reform, not just the nibbling around the edges, which is what we keep seeing here in Illinois. And so last year, all the business groups sat down with the governor's office and leadership, Republican, Democrat, trying to craft something that would actually make a difference in the cost of doing business in the state of Illinois. Unfortunately, the bill that passed and was signed into law, again, was nibbling around the edges. And so NFIB and the chamber have made it a priority to be able to say, you can't check mark the box and say we're done, because we're not done. We haven't addressed the #1 cost driver, which is causation. And so, Leader Cross, I'm wondering, I know obviously your caucus and Senator Radogno's caucus continue that fight as well. What do you think the chances are of, probably not this year, but in the near future, addressing workers' compensation again?
I think the fact that we're not seeing rates drop and that they're actually continuing to climb.
What do you think?
Hello.
They wanted me to go. You go ahead, sir.
What?
You can go.
No, I was just saying that the question is whether we'll do anything on causation. I think if you see more companies talk about leaving or leaving, and if you see rates continue to rise, not drop like they've alleged they're going to be, I think you'll see there's a greater chance of addressing causation. I hope.
So we've been joined with Senate Republican Leader Christine Radogno, and these guys are both very busy today. We are in session over at the Capitol, so we appreciate, Senator Radogno, you making it over here. I know it's tough.
I apologize for being late.
That's okay. No problem. Well, we were just discussing, Tom sort of gave them a quick overview of the pension situation, and sort of a similar situation with comp that we faced last year, which was hours and hours and hours of negotiations, and then a bill that passed that we, of course, didn't believe went far enough. So I was just asking Tom, do you think that in the near future, maybe not this year, but in the near future, we may see some real reform on causation when it comes to comp?
So again, the criteria against which we measure whether or not it was successful is whether or not our rates are competitive with other states, not just whether they drop, not just whether they stabilize, the whole concept here is to be competitive. Obviously, we were able to pass some reforms that needed to be done, but our caucus, as you may be aware, actually voted on a bill that did include some pretty strong causation language. Every single Republican voted for it. Democrats all voted present, which is interesting because that says to me they know that that's what really needs to happen. They just didn't have the political will to get that done, quite frankly, because of the trial lawyers and the unions. So I think once we have the data that shows that we're not where we need to be, we come back and we argue aggressively to look again at that language. And there's a lot of models out there. We brought to the table several models from other states of causation language. So it's definitely something that will have to be done if we're not competitive.
And I think in that same vein, we also the legislature also passed some reforms on unemployment insurance. That also was a negotiated bill that we did support, only because it was certainly better than doing nothing. But there are a lot of reforms that were left on the table that we believe really do need to be addressed. And so I don't know if you think in the future, I don't know if you're hearing from your constituents that these are top business issues, particularly given the unemployment rate that we've had in the past couple of years. Do you anticipate any other action on UI or?
I think, in my view, workers' comp might be first. What I hear from people is they view the unemployment situation as a disincentive for people to work, and we really do need to get a handle on that it ends up being a better deal to extend your unemployment than to get back to work, which spirals down into the whole revenue situation for the state as people don't pay taxes.
I think it all needs to be on the table. I think comp needs to be there, unemployment. I would argue med-mal and tort reform in the business community. It all needs to be there. We did a few other little things over in the veto session, as you know, on R&D, on tax credits and things like that, and estate tax. None of it went far enough. So it always should be on the table. But when I'm out talking to folks, business folks, they all want business stuff clearly done, but it's also like get the budget fixed. Get pensions, get Medicaid fixed, because if you don't, I think there's the big fear you're coming after business to get it solved. And I think that seems to be the one thing that comes out very, very in a strong way from business folks. Not that the business stuff, believe me, I'm not at all suggesting it's not important, but get your fiscal house in order.
Yeah, well, to amplify that point, people realize who might potentially invest in this state that if we don't get a handle on the budget, and the only way to do that is Medicaid and pension reform is some of the bigger pieces of it. There's been many projections done, including by the governor's own staff, suggesting that we will have a multi-billion-dollar deficit in just a few years, despite the tax increase that just went through. And what that means is not only will they be nickel and diming it again with businesses, but there most likely will have to be another general tax increase. So with that kind of uncertainty, just waiting for the other shoe to drop, people are very hesitant to invest here, and we need to turn that around.
As you know, we had Governor Walker here earlier today. We had a few protesters outside.
Which state is he from?
He's from Wisconsin. But he was asked the question by an audience member, of all the things that you've done, what's the one thing that has turned your economy around? And he said the budget. That you've got to have stability, and they have some political instability right now. Certainly the fiscal stability is there, and that's what attracts businesses. So it really echoes that. A couple other issues that maybe aren't huge at the Capitol, but I know are important. We have a lot of local chambers of commerce here and others who care deeply about the issue of enterprise zones. Enterprise zones we have hundreds of them in the state of Illinois, and they have really, for many communities, been key to being able to grow their local economy and grow their communities. And many of these enterprise zones are about ready to expire. I don't know how many of you realize that. And it's been a little bit of a political football at the Capitol, because some Democrats say, well, let's do a return on investment. Let's make sure that the enterprise zones are working. Why are we giving these tax breaks? We don't really know if they're bringing jobs. And so I know if you guys could speak to that issue a little bit, I'm sure you hear from your local communities about enterprise zones.
Well, as you may be aware, there's a study group right now looking at the return on investment, that sort of thing. I know that between enterprise zones and TIF districts, there's not a lot else out there for local development, and it's critical that we preserve what we do have. We always need to be looking at whether or not programs are doing the job that they're doing, but I think that the evidence that I've seen regarding enterprise zones and the jobs created says to me that we probably need to extend those. I don't know what has driven the particular focus on this time. I do know the speaker at one point suggested that perhaps they be bid competitively. I don't know exactly what he had in mind with respect to that, and I don't believe that's come at the hearings, but we are certainly keeping a very close eye to be sure that there's no other agenda involved as we try to make sure that this economic tool that's been working stays in place.
You need, whether it's enterprise zones or it's TIF districts or it's research and development tax credits, you need some certainty and you need some stability, as Kimberly used, on a long-term basis. And so what we do around here, not we, but what some people do around here is say, well, the idea of a research and development tax credit looks good for businesses. Instead of making it permanent like most states do, we'll make it good for a year or 5 years, then everybody's got to come into our offices and be nice to us and maybe contribute to us, and they have to do things we ask them to do. It is an awful way to do business. It's not the way you should run a state. You need long-term stability and certainty, and you ought to have an enterprise zone that's 15, 20, 30, 40 years. We're all for making sure they're legitimate. We're all for making sure that they work a certain way and that they're cost-effective. But if you're going to invest, you want to know that that thing's going to be there for a long way. Same whether you're Caterpillar or John Deere with R&D tax credits. They ought to be permanent. They ought to be permanent. But we play a little game around here of making sure people have to come to our offices and say and do all the right things. And it's lousy. It's lousy. I'm not saying when I say we, certain people that are in power in the state, and it's a lousy way to do business. And I know I'm in a small room and they won't get out. So it's just us. Just us friends here. But that's the reality. They need to be long-term and they need to be permanent to a large degree, and you need to know. You ought to know as a community what the life of the enterprise zone is. You ought to know what, from a business standpoint, what the life of the enterprise zone is. If you don't like them, you don't have to do them, or you don't have to impose them in your TIF district in your community. That's up to you. But if you're going to do it for a certain amount of time so it works. I mean, you look at what every other state around us does, just on R&D. I'm pretty sure we did the research on it. They're all permanent. I use R&D as an example. Most communities or most states around us don't have an estate tax. We have these little layers. So I'm sorry to go off on it, but you need to make them long-term.
Well, and the other issue that came up a few years ago with enterprise zones, which sort of started to spark this discussion, was the idea of requiring prevailing wage, which is union scale, on private development within enterprise zones. And so we would certainly, adamantly oppose to something like that. And as we move forward with enterprise zones, ask that you make sure that's not part of any extension, because of course, private development, no public dollars, but because they happen to be in an enterprise zone, because maybe sewers were put in or sidewalks were put in with tax dollars, unions think that now should all be union scale.
I'm a no.
Thank you.
Yeah, as is our caucus. I think you'll find a lot of support there.
The next issue, which we did hear a little bit about, which is Medicaid. The idea that last year alone, and correct me if I'm incorrect in this, that Illinois spent $2.7 billion more on Medicaid than was budgeted. Is that about?
We pushed bills off quite a bit. I'm not sure that number around there.
So we continue to incur the expenses, but didn't appropriate enough money to pay the bills. So the consequence of that is you just push the bills off into the next fiscal year. Yes.
Because often the three issues that we hear about that are strangling the state: pensions, Medicaid, and of course $8 billion in unpaid bills. Some of the folks in the audience may actually have some unpaid bills at their office. So if you could just talk a little bit, Senator Radogno, about Medicaid and how you think that might get solved, if you think that might get solved this year.
It's a very difficult job to solve, because once you give something, it's very difficult to take it away. Medicaid is a huge program that is expanding, and interestingly in Illinois has expanded more rapidly before we had the recession than it did during and after, or during the recovery period. And the reason for that is because of the eligibility expansions that were put into place under the previous administration. So now we're faced with the task of the only way to really get a handle on this is either cut the populations who are eligible, cut the services that are out there, or cut rates to providers. None of those things are easy to do. But there is a group, a bicameral, bipartisan group working on that. Unfortunately, to date, they haven't had a lot of success. Part of it is, too, that there's a reluctance from the administration to even do things such as fraud control that we passed last year. Something called passive redetermination, where people, once you're eligible for Medicaid, essentially you're always eligible until you submit something to the state on a proactive basis saying, I'm not eligible. Well, that makes no sense at all. We passed that. The administration is still doing that. I just learned that today. So even though they're talking a good game because Medicaid is such a big part of the budget, what will actually come together in terms of voting to make those tough decisions to reduce services, populations, or rates, I don't know that we'll really see something meaningful.
Leader Cross.
The goal is to take out 2.7 of the money at the moment needed for Medicaid. So that means we would appropriate 6.6 billion and we would cut 2.7. And Chris is right. Her caucus and Chris, they've done a great job on Medicaid reform for a number of years. Patty Bellock in our caucus has been active along with Dale Ryder. And I would argue, not to get partisan, but that Republicans have been very aggressive on pushing for Medicaid reform for a number of years. But there's room to do it. I mean, if you just, I think we have about 2.5 billion people on Medicaid, 2.5 million people on Medicaid. If you just question it, as Chris alluded to, just the eligibility and kind of scrub the rolls, so to speak, we think we could knock off at least 200,000 people that have no longer have any business on it. And then you're going to hear a lot about, you've heard a lot about residency, you've heard a lot about income verification. The question becomes, after we pass if we scale back Medicaid, whether the governor is going to implement it or whether or not he's gone to the federal government to ask for a waiver to implement it. And that's really, we're going to start getting into that next phase. We have been for a little while. To the General Assembly's credit, both our Republicans and Democrats, and some of this lately, they have come together, and the governor just has not taken the next step to say to the federal government, will you let us implement some of these changes? Other states have. Other states, even with Democrat governors, have gone to the federal government and said, will you allow us to scale back and verify income and verify residency? And this governor's been, quite frankly, just a little, it has not been as aggressive as, in our opinion, he needs to be. But we've got to get on the, as Chris said, if we don't get this 2.7 cut, we'll be facing, I think I saw a number the other day, if we leave it alone, just in Medicaid bills alone in 5 years, we'll be, I think, at about 21 billion in Medicaid bills, 21 billion in 5 years. It's insane. I mean, again, you don't have any choice on some of this stuff, and there'll never be a good time to do it, and we have to do it.
I do think that just because whenever I tell people this, they just can't believe it. So maybe you're down on your luck and you become eligible for Medicaid. No one ever asks you year after year after year if you're still down on your luck. So you could stay on Medicaid and be making $80,000 a year because they're not checking. And then the other was the pay stub. Right. They still require just one pay stub.
Right. So if you're temporarily unemployed, you get on and there's never any check to see, are you employed? Yeah.
Right.
Well, see, the same person that runs the voting list in Chicago is doing the Medicaid list here in the state.
A lot of dead people receiving Medicaid.
They got the blueprint for it, so it's working for them.
Yeah. Great.
But I do want to emphasize, it's not, fraud is a piece of it, but we will need to make real cuts, and it is going to be very difficult. So just to give you a few examples of things that are low-hanging fruit. Prescription eyeglasses. Right now there's absolutely no limitation whatsoever in the Medicaid program. Most likely, if you have private insurance, it's like one pair every 2 years or something like that. Prescription drugs. Other states have limited 5 prescriptions unless there's a thorough medical override to have more. What it's actually done is cut down on a lot of fraud, people that doctor shop, and cut down on emergency room visits for adverse drug interactions. So again, there's a lot of models out there. Illinois far exceeds the federal standards in a number of areas. We're going to have to dial it back. But if you're taking, 18 prescriptions, you're not going to like to hear you're going to have to jump through hoops to get more than 5. Or if you're getting glasses every year and now we say, sorry, it's going to be every 3 or 5 years, you're not going to like that. And ideally, we wouldn't have to do it. But those are the decisions we're going to have to make.
That's a good point.
I think we've got a few minutes left. We'd like to take some questions, about 5 minutes. If you guys have some questions for Leader Radogno or Leader Cross. Anybody?
Wow, that was easy.
Tom Mercier, Boppy, Bloomington, Illinois.
Check. When it comes to unemployment insurance, I mean, this first quarter of this year for me represented 24% of my payroll. That can't continue. I mean, you either got to lay people off, lay more people off, but you're sure as heck not going to hire anybody else. So the question is, you know, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. You know, you want to try and help somebody, but at the other hand, you've taken the employer and tied his hands. So, I mean, we had to lay 7 of 60 people off in 2010. And it's hammering me big time right now. So that fund has got to get fixed, and we got to get people back to work. And it all comes around back to the physical statute of the state. So, good luck.
Thanks.
Part of that too was the FUTA tax hit that employers took because we borrowed and we missed the deadlines to pay back because we had no money to pay back. But the good news is that hit will go away next year. I know it was a tough hit in 2012, there's just no question. But because of the legislation that did pass, that FUTA tax hit will go away next year.
My question is, we just saw a presentation from the Cook Political Report on the congressional redistricting. What are the prospects for both of your respective caucuses heading into this remap year, and what support do you need from the business community going forward?
Well, think about it in this way. I'm sure John Cullerton's had a comparable flow of money into his coffers. I think the last quarter of last year, the Speaker got $1.5 million just from the unions. SCIU, IFT, IEA, AFL-CIO, AFSCME. So they're engaged in a big way, and we definitely can use support in a significant way financially, because last year, in the last cycle, we were between 6 and 7 million. The Speaker was between 9 and 10, just on our side, million. We had a great, as good as we've ever done, but he was able to, from trial lawyers and the unions, raise significant amounts of money. This is the first time we've gone into an election where we've had some clear distinctions. Just about every Democrat that will be running against voted for the tax increase, the largest tax increase in the history of the state. We haven't had that kind of distinction and opportunity to differentiate between parties. And we can also make a case about how they've run the state from a spending standpoint, a borrowing standpoint, debt, et cetera, and legitimately so. So I think people make a big deal about redistricting. In many ways, it's not all, we don't feel all that bad about it. We would have loved to have drawn the map, but it shored us up. And I would think the other thing I'd say is downstate, there's a lot of room to grow still. And at least in our caucus, I suspect Chris would tell you the same, that the demographics have changed. Just the outlook on state government. I think people in downstate, not that upstate don't, but people in downstate Illinois pay attention to state government. You know, their papers cover it. You have a lot more facilities. You have a lot more people working in state government. And you know, in suburban papers, it just depends. Sometimes you see stuff at state government, sometimes you don't. But you always see things about state government when you're south. And so that, in my opinion, bodes well for us. We picked up 6 seats last cycle, and most of them, all of them were downstate. So, long answer.
I'm very encouraged about the election coming up. I've actually been out visiting with candidates in different parts of the state over the break. And despite the fact that the Democrats drew the map, they have ended up with many more competitive seats than they hoped that they would have because the dilution of the Democrat vote in Chicago. So, for example, we have a suburbanite who had hoped to move into the city and get a nice solid 60% Democrat district, who got pushed further into the suburbs, into a more Republican competitive area. Secondly, voters are paying attention because of what's going on in this state and because it's finally impacting the average person, whereas in years past, they really didn't experience state government. But now suburbanites have their recent college graduates living in their basement because they can't get a job, or they know someone who's been laid off, or they're worried about their income having gone down if they're a small business owner, and how am I going to, you know, maintain my lifestyle. So people are paying acute attention even in the suburban areas and amplified downstate, as Tom said. The result of that has been to the people, high quality candidates, people who are successful in their own careers, who are well involved in their community, have come forward to run. So we're dealing with a terrific crop of candidates. So we need money to get the message out, but I don't want this to sound like a fundraising pitch only. We will be doing that. But it's important that you talk to your friends, your neighbors, your employees, and when they say, but I like my rep, she's so nice and she's pretty conservative, we have to say, you know what, that's true, but what is her voting record and what is the agenda that has been put forth by that decision? I mean, they really have to take a hard look at that. We have a lot of nice people running too. They need to get to know those folks and put them in office if they want to see a change in direction in this state.
Would you agree that most of the candidates on your side of the aisle running now are to the right of maybe what you saw 10 years ago? Most of the types of candidates that you have running in terms of business owners, people who maybe are, compared to 10 years ago where we were looking for the suburban type, female type candidate, now it seems more like the candidates are definitely, whether it's through the Tea Party process or whatever, definitely trending more conservative.
I would say fiscally more conservative.
Fiscally,
which,
yeah.
And what's so interesting now is the one issue that has been very divisive in the Republican Party, not one, but the social issues as a group, have taken such a back seat because of the economic issue. And there is really a clarity of thought with respect to the candidates we have as to what needs to happen. That we do need to actually shrink government, create a better working environment. So, and many of these people have been business owners, been involved in businesses, so they have a lot of experience in that area. So in that regard, again, the accomplishment of our candidates is pretty impressive.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.